The Curse of Killing Dogs. A Father's Ultimate Sacrifice. Summary. In a remote village, a family's act of cruelty toward a mysterious white dog triggers a relentless curse. John, the desperate father, kills the animal for food, unleashing a chain of eerie and horrifying events. Shadows move, objects shift, and the family begins to experience visions of a bloodied man and the dog, now a spectral figure. The son, Michael, spirals into madness, haunted by nightmares and a dark secret tied to a woman's death in the woods. Desperate for answers, John consults a village elder, who reveals the curse is tied to past sins and the dog's sacred nature. To break the curse, the family must confront their guilt and perform a ritual of atonement. In a chilling climax, the dog's spirit and the ghost of the murdered woman demand justice. John pays the ultimate price, consumed by supernatural flames. Though the haunting ends, Martha and Michael are left scarred, carrying the weight of their actions and the cost of redemption. This tale is a haunting exploration of guilt, the consequences of cruelty, and the unrelenting pursuit of justice from beyond the grave. Part 1. The Fatal Decision. The sun hung high in a pale, cloudless sky, casting harsh light over the weathered village. John, a middle-aged man with deep lines etched into his face, squinted as he dragged his boots through the dusty path leading home. His hands, rough from years of labor, clenched tightly around a bag containing meager scraps for dinner. Yet he knew it wouldn't be enough. "John, we can't keep living like this," Martha, his wife, had said that morning, her voice heavy with despair. She had been nursing their dwindling stock of rice for weeks, stretching every grain into meals that barely filled their bellies. Their son, Michael, was growing weaker by the day, his once rosy cheeks now hollow and pale. As he approached the ramshackle cottage, John noticed movement near the tree line. A flash of white fur darted between the shadows. His heart skipped. There, standing at the edge of the forest, was a dog unlike any he'd ever seen. Its coat shimmered like snow, its eyes a startling shade of ice blue. It watched him, unblinking, as if daring him to approach. John's stomach growled audibly. "A gift from the heavens," he murmured, though his words felt like blasphemy even to himself. Desperation had long eroded his moral compass. Without hesitation, he fetched a rope and knife from the shed and called out to Martha. "Martha! There's a dog." "We'll have meat tonight." She emerged from the house, wiping her hands on her apron. Her expression darkened when she saw the dog. "John, no, look at it. It's not normal." He waved off her concerns. "It's a dog, Martha. Food. Do you want Michael to starve?" Reluctantly, Martha helped him corner the animal. Strangely, the dog didn't run. It stood still, staring at them with an unnerving calmness. When John looped the rope around its neck, it didn't resist. As he raised the knife, his hands trembled. The dog's gaze bore into his soul, filled with something he couldn't name, not fear, but understanding. Almost forgiveness. With a single swift motion, it was done. The dog let out a sound that was neither bark nor whimper, but something deep and guttural that seemed to echo in the wind. Blood pooled on the ground, dark and thick. The smell was overpowering, metallic and earthy. Martha turned away, her hands covering her mouth. "God forgive us," she whispered. But John didn't look at her. He couldn't. The afternoon passed in uneasy silence. Michael, oblivious to the source of the meat, perked up at the prospect of a decent meal. Martha's hands shook as she prepared the cuts, though she tried to hide her discomfort. Every time she glanced at the meat, she swore she saw the faint shimmer of white fur. When the family finally sat down to eat, the atmosphere felt heavy. Each scrape of cutlery against their mismatched plates echoed too loudly in the cramped room. John took a bite first, chewing slowly, his jaw tense. Martha followed, her face pale as she forced the morsel down. Michael, eager for sustenance, took a large bite but immediately froze. "It's weird," he muttered, pushing his plate away. "It doesn't taste right." John's voice cut through the room like a blade. "It's food. Be thankful." His eyes, however, betrayed his own unease. The meat was chewy, its flavor faintly bitter, as if it carried the weight of something unnatural. As the evening deepened, the village seemed to grow quieter. No wind stirred the trees, and the usual calls of nocturnal animals were absent. Inside the cottage, the oppressive stillness settled like a shroud. Martha lay awake, her ears straining for any sound. She could hear John's restless movements in the adjacent room, his muttered groans of discomfort. Michael, who usually slept soundly, whimpered in his sleep, his voice breaking with fear. In the pitch-black hours of the night, John was jolted awake by a sudden sharp noise. At first he thought it was the creak of the old floorboards. But then he heard it again, a low, guttural growl, followed by a faint scratching sound. His breath quickened. "Who's there?" he whispered into the dark. No response. He reached for the candle on his bedside table and struck a match. The weak flame flickered, casting jagged shadows across the walls. And then he saw it. At the foot of his bed stood the dog. Its white fur glowed faintly in the dim light, and its ice-blue eyes bored into him. But it was different now. Blood streaked its coat, and its gaze was no longer calm. It was piercing, accusing. John froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. "Martha," he shouted, his voice cracking. But when he blinked, the dog was gone. The room was empty, save for the lingering scent of iron. Martha burst into the room moments later, her face pale and drawn. "What is it? What happened?" the dog John stammered. "It was here. I saw it," she frowned, her hands clutching the front of her nightgown. "You're imagining things. Go back to sleep," but her voice wavered, betraying her own unease. The next morning, the unease in the house had thickened into something almost tangible. Michael refused to eat, claiming he felt sick. Martha busied herself with chores, but her hands shook as she scrubbed the pots. John sat by the window, staring out at the forest, his jaw clenched. The memory of the dog's eyes haunted him. By evening, the strange occurrences escalated. Objects moved on their own. The kitchen knife, the same one used to slaughter the dog, was found standing upright in the middle of the table, its blade gleaming. Shadows seemed to dart in the corners of the room, and the air grew colder with each passing hour. Michael's nightmares worsened. He woke screaming, his face drenched in sweat. "It's here," he sobbed. "The dog. It's watching me." John's temper boiled over. "Enough. There's no dog. You're scaring your mother." But even as he spoke, he felt a chill crawl up his spine. That night, none of them slept. In the suffocating silence, they could all hear it, faint whispers, growing louder and more insistent. "You took what was not yours." To be continued. Part 2. Shadows of Guilt. The sun rose on the cottage, but the air inside remained heavy, oppressive. Sleep had been elusive for the family, each of them haunted by the events of the previous day. John sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his hands. Martha moved silently around the house, her face pale and drawn. Even Michael, usually full of youthful energy, seemed subdued, his eyes shadowed with fatigue. The first sign of something amiss came mid-morning. Martha, scrubbing the remnants of breakfast from a pot, froze when she noticed a faint red streak on the floor. At first she thought it was a spill, but as she wiped at it, the mark seemed to grow darker, more vivid, until it resembled blood. Her hands shook as she stepped back, her breathing shallow. "John," she called, her voice trembling. "Come here." He appeared in the doorway, his brows furrowing at her tone. "What is it?" Martha pointed to the streak, now spreading unnaturally across the floor. John crouched down, running his fingers over it. The substance was sticky, its metallic scent unmistakable. Blood. But from where? Before either of them could speak further, a crash echoed from the next room. They rushed in to find the kitchen knife, the very one used to kill the dog, embedded in the wooden table, standing upright. Martha let out a strangled cry, clutching at her chest. "What's happening?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. John didn't answer. His face was ashen, his hands clenched into fists. That night, Michael's cries shattered the uneasy silence. Martha was the first to reach his room, her heart pounding. She found him sitting upright in bed, his body drenched in sweat, his eyes wild with terror. "It's here," he sobbed, pointing to the corner of the room. "The dog, it's in the shadows." Martha turned, her breath catching as she saw the faint outline of something large and white. But as she moved closer, the figure dissolved into darkness. "It's just a nightmare," she said, though her voice wavered. She wrapped her arms around Michael, trying to calm him. "It's not real." "It is," Michael insisted. "It was looking at me. And there was someone else with it. A man. Covered in blood." The following days brought no relief. Shadows flickered where no light should have cast them. Unseen footsteps creaked across the wooden floors at all hours. The air grew colder, and the faint, metallic scent of blood seemed to cling to everything. Michael's condition worsened. He spent his days and a daze, muttering about the dog and the bloodied man. At night, his screams tore through the stillness, waking the entire household. Martha wept quietly in her room, the strain of it all wearing her thin. John, too proud to admit his growing fear, grew more irritable with each passing day. One evening, as the family sat in the dimly lit living room, the whispers began. Faint at first, like the rustle of leaves, but they grew louder, more distinct. Words formed, chilling in their clarity. "You took what was not yours." Martha clutched at John's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "What is that?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer, his eyes darting around the room. The whispers grew louder, circling them, pressing in from all sides. Then, as suddenly as they had started, they stopped. The silence that followed was suffocating. Michael's behavior became more erratic. He refused to sleep, his eyes darting around as if expecting the dog to appear at any moment. He began drawing disturbing images in charcoal on the walls: a white dog with glowing eyes, a man drenched in blood, and dark, twisted shapes that seemed to writhe on the surface. One night, Martha found him in the kitchen, staring at the knife embedded in the table. "Michael," she said softly, stepping closer. "What are you doing?" He turned to her, his eyes hollow. "It's not over," he said. "The dog wants something. It won't stop until it gets it." "What does it want?" Martha asked, her voice breaking. Michael didn't answer. Instead, he walked past her, disappearing into the shadows of the hallway. John's temper finally erupted a few days later. He stormed into Michael's room, grabbed him by the shoulders, and shook him. "Enough of this nonsense," he shouted. "There's no dog, no man. You're scaring your mother." But Michael only stared at him with a chilling calmness. "You'll see," he said simply. "It's not nonsense." That night, as the family tried to sleep, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "You took what was not yours. And now you will pay." A loud bang shook the house, followed by the sound of shattering glass. John rushed into the living room, his heart pounding. The windows were intact, but the air was thick with the scent of blood. In the center of the room stood the white dog, its eyes glowing like embers. Standing beside it was the man Michael had described, his face obscured by blood, his expression unreadable. John froze, unable to move or speak. The man raised a hand, pointing directly at him. The room filled with an unnatural wind, and the whispers became a deafening roar. The haunting didn't subside. In the days that followed, the dog appeared more frequently, always lingering at the edge of sight. It would vanish when approached, leaving behind deep claw marks on the walls or streaks of blood that seeped into the floorboards. Martha began hearing faint growls at night, emanating from corners of the house that were impossibly dark. She grew pale and gaunt, her eyes darting around nervously. Michael, on the other hand, seemed to be slipping further away. He rarely spoke and spent hours scribbling in a notebook, his charcoal drawings becoming increasingly disturbing. One of the drawings caught Martha's eye, a crude depiction of their family standing in the living room, surrounded by dark figures with glowing eyes. At the center of the image was the white dog, its mouth open in a silent snarl. "Michael, what does this mean?" she asked, holding up the page. "It's what's coming," he said flatly. "They're going to take everything." John's denial was wearing thin. He tried to keep himself busy, repairing the barn or chopping firewood, but every moment alone felt suffocating. The air seemed to hum with an unseen presence, and his tools would often vanish, only to reappear in strange places. One evening, as he worked in the yard, he heard a low growl behind him. Turning slowly, he saw the dog, its glowing eyes fixed on him. Before he could react, it lunged. He swung the axe instinctively, but it passed through the creature like smoke. The dog dissolved into the air, leaving behind a single bloody paw print in the dirt. John staggered back, clutching his chest. For the first time, he admitted to himself what he had refused to acknowledge: they were being hunted by something beyond their understanding. To be continued. Part 3. The haunting begins. Night had settled over the cottage, but sleep was a luxury no one could afford. The whispers had returned, weaving through the still air like venomous threads. Martha lay rigid in her bed, her heart pounding as she stared at the shadows crawling across the walls. It had been days since she last felt safe, and tonight was no different. A soft growl broke the silence. Her breath caught. It wasn't coming from outside this time, it was inside the house. Slowly, she slipped out of bed, her bare feet brushing against the cold wooden floor. She tiptoed through the hallway, every creak beneath her weight sounding like thunder in the oppressive quiet. The growling grew louder, leading her to the kitchen. There, illuminated by the faint light of the moon spilling through the window, stood a man. His face was obscured by streaks of blood, his hollow, black eyes piercing the darkness. Beside him was the white dog, its glowing eyes fixed on her, its body as still as a statue. Martha froze, unable to scream. The man spoke, his voice a low rasp that seemed to echo from another world. "You cannot escape what you have done." Martha's knees buckled, and she clung to the doorway for support. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The man tilted his head, his expression unreadable. "The one you wronged. The one who seeks justice." Before she could respond, the dog let out a bone-chilling howl. It reverberated through the house, shaking the walls and causing the dishes on the shelves to rattle. The figure and the dog vanished as suddenly as they had appeared, leaving behind only the acrid scent of blood. The next morning, Martha confided in John, her voice shaking as she recounted the encounter. But her husband dismissed her fears with a wave of his hand. "You were dreaming," he said gruffly, though his eyes betrayed his unease. "We're all on edge. This curse is just in our minds." Martha's lips quivered. "John, it wasn't a dream. The dog was there. The man. He spoke to me." John didn't respond. Instead, he grabbed his coat and headed outside, muttering something about fixing the barn. Martha watched him leave, a heavy sense of dread settling over her. That afternoon, Michael's erratic behavior reached new heights. He sat in the living room, his notebook open on his lap, furiously sketching. Martha approached cautiously, her eyes widening as she saw the image taking shape on the page. It was the man from her vision, his bloodied face and black eyes staring back at her. "Michael," she said softly, kneeling beside him. "How do you know what he looks like?" Michael didn't look up. "He came to me last night. He said we have to pay. He said the dog won't stop until we do." Martha felt a chill run down her spine. Pay for what? Michael finally met her gaze, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "For what Dad did." As the days turned into nights, the haunting grew more aggressive. Doors slammed on their own. The windows would fog over with strange, claw-like marks etched into the glass. The faint growling Martha had heard before became a constant presence, sometimes so close it felt as if the dog was breathing down her neck. One evening, as the family sat together in the living room, the lights flickered and then went out entirely. The darkness was suffocating. John cursed under his breath, fumbling for a match. But before he could strike it, the whispers returned, louder than ever. "You cannot run. You cannot hide." Martha clung to Michael, her fingers digging into his shoulders. John stood, his fists clenched, his voice shaking with fury. "Show yourself," he shouted into the void. The room fell silent. Then, slowly the white dog emerged from the shadows. Its eyes glowed like embers, its teeth bared in a silent snarl. Behind it, the man appeared, his bloodied form towering over them. He pointed a finger at John, his voice ringing with unearthly power. "You stole from the living and the dead. Now, You will pay the price." The dog lunged, its spectral form passing through John like a cold wind. He gasped, clutching his chest as he fell to his knees. Martha screamed, pulling Michael closer as the man and the dog vanished once more, leaving the family trembling in the dark. John's health began to deteriorate rapidly after the encounter. He grew pale and gaunt, his breaths shallow and labored. Martha pleaded with him to seek help, but he refused. "It won't matter," he said one evening, his voice barely a whisper. "They won't let us go." Michael, too, seemed to be slipping further into the grip of the curse. He spoke less and less, spending his days scribbling incomprehensible symbols in his notebook. Martha found herself the only one holding on, desperately trying to keep the family together as the forces around them closed in. One night, as she sat alone in the kitchen, her head in her hands, she heard the growling again. This time it was right behind her. She turned slowly, her heart pounding in her chest. The dog was there, its glowing eyes locking onto hers. But it wasn't alone. The man stood beside it, his face more grotesque than before, his eyes like bottomless pits. He leaned down, his voice a hiss in her ear. "Confess, or lose everything." Martha's tears flowed freely as she collapsed to the floor. She didn't know what he meant, but she knew one thing for certain: time was running out. The night stretched endlessly after the warning, each hour fraught with unrelenting fear. Martha no longer felt safe in any corner of the house. The shadows seemed alive, pulsating with the presence of the dog and its master. Her mind replayed the man's words, his voice sharp and cruel, slicing through her sanity. The growling became an ever-present companion. It echoed from empty rooms, from the attic, and even from beneath the floorboards. The family avoided each other, consumed by their own dread. Michael's drawings grew more frantic, the shapes he sketched transforming into grotesque figures with distorted limbs and faces frozen in screams. Martha could no longer deny the truth: the dog's curse wasn't just haunting them, it was consuming them. One morning, while preparing a meager breakfast, she noticed fresh claw marks across the kitchen table. The wood was splintered, the grooves deep and jagged. A sudden crash from the living room made her drop the pan. She rushed in, finding John sprawled on the floor, gasping for air. His face was pale, his eyes wide with terror. "They were here," he croaked, his voice barely audible. "The dog and the man. They were standing over me." To be continued. Part 4. Michael's descent. Michael's demeanor darkened with each passing day. The once bright, carefree boy had become withdrawn, his face pale and sunken. He avoided his mother's gaze and rarely spoke, his eyes always darting nervously, as though he expected something to emerge from the shadows. Martha tried her best to reach him. "Michael, talk to me," she pleaded one morning, kneeling beside him as he sat rigidly on his bed. "Please. What's happening to you?" Michael didn't look at her. Instead, he stared down at his trembling hands. I see them, Mom," he whispered. "The dog. The man. They're always watching me." Martha's heart ached for her son. "It's just dreams," she said, though her voice lacked conviction. "You're scared and I understand. But you're safe here." Michael's head snapped up, his eyes wide with a terror that sent a chill down Martha's spine. "Safe," he hissed. "They're here, Mom. They're in the house. They know what I did." Martha's stomach twisted. "What you did?" "Michael, what do you mean?" He clenched his fists, his knuckles white. "It's my fault. All of it. The dog. It's because of what I did to her." The confession came later that night, as the house groaned under the weight of the wind outside. Michael sat cross-legged on the floor of his room, his notebook discarded beside him. Martha and John stood over him, their faces a mix of worry and confusion. "There was a girl," Michael began, his voice barely above a whisper. "A few months ago. I met her in the woods. She was lost, scared. I told her I'd help her find her way back, but I didn't." Martha's hand flew to her mouth. "Michael, what did you do?" He wouldn't look at her. His gaze remained fixed on a single point on the floor. "I left her there. Alone. I didn't mean to, but she was crying, and it made me angry. I yelled at her and ran off." The room fell silent. Even the wind seemed as still as Martha and John exchanged horrified glances. Michael's voice cracked. I went back the next day. I wanted to apologize, but she was gone. I found her scarf near the creek. There was blood on it. Martha sank to her knees, tears streaming down her face. Why didn't you tell us? Michael's body shook with silent sobs. I was scared. And then the dog showed up. It's her dog. I know it is. It's here because of me. The revelation added a new layer of tension to the household. John, already consumed by guilt over his own actions, became increasingly hostile. This isn't your fault, he snapped one evening as Michael sat silently at the dinner table. This curse isn't about you. Martha placed a trembling hand on her husband's arm. John, please. He's a child. John pulled away, his jaw clenched. A child who might have gotten someone killed, he muttered under his breath, storming out of the room. Michael's gaze dropped to his plate, his shoulders slumping under the weight of his father's words. Martha leaned over, whispering softly, we'll figure this out. Together. I promise, but Michael's descent continued. He began speaking in his sleep, his murmurs incoherent but laced with fear. He often woke up screaming, his sheets tangled and drenched in sweat. The drawings in his notebook became darker, depicting not only the dog and the man but also a young girl, her face twisted in anguish. In every image, the dog stood protectively by her side. One morning, Martha found Michael staring out the window, his eyes glassy. She's out there, he said without turning to her. She's waiting for me. Martha's breath hitched. Who? Michael, he turned to her, his expression eerily calm. The girl. And the dog. They want me to come to the woods. The whispers became more frequent, their tone sharper, almost accusatory. You left her, they hissed. You abandoned her. Michael began retreating into himself even further. He barely ate, barely spoke. One night, Martha found him in the living room, clutching the bloody scarf he had retrieved from the woods. I hear her, he said, his voice trembling. She calls my name. She wants me to go back. John's patience snapped. We're not entertaining this nonsense anymore, he growled, grabbing the scarf and throwing it into the fire. Michael screamed, lunging toward the flames, but Martha held him back. No, he cried, tears streaming down his face. You don't understand. That was hers. She'll be angry now. John turned away, his face a mask of frustration and denial. This ends here, he muttered. But it didn't end. That night, the growling returned, louder and closer than ever. The family awoke to the sound of clawing at the walls, the unmistakable sound of nails scraping against wood. Michael huddled in the corner of his room, rocking back and forth as the whispers surrounded him. You cannot hide, they said. You must face what you've done. When the noises subsided, the family gathered in the living room, their faces pale and drawn. Michael stood in the center, clutching his notebook. I have to go, he said firmly. I have to go back to the woods. Martha shook her head, tears streaming down her face. No, Michael. We'll figure this out here. We'll fix it together. But Michael's expression was resolute. They won't stop until I do. To be continued. Part 5. Seeking the Elder. The house had become unbearable. The oppressive whispers, the growling, and the eerie clawing at the walls had turned every moment into a waking nightmare. Michael's descent into despair had shaken Martha to her core, but it was John who could no longer ignore the severity of their plight. We need answers, John muttered one morning, his voice hoarse. His hands trembled as he laced his boots. If we keep sitting here, this curse will kill us all. Martha's eyes, rimmed red from countless sleepless nights, flickered with a shred of hope. You're going to the elder? John nodded. The village elder was known for his wisdom and knowledge of the old ways. If anyone understood what was happening to them, it would be him. The path to the elder's cabin was shrouded in mist. The forest, usually alive with the chirping of birds and rustling leaves, was silent. Every step John took seemed louder than it should have been, the crunch of twigs beneath his boots echoing unnaturally. The cabin emerged from the fog, a decrepit structure surrounded by overgrown plants. A faint curl of smoke rose from the chimney, and the scent of burning herbs hung heavy in the air. John hesitated at the door, his fist raised to knock, when it swung open on its own. The elder stood there, his weathered face shadowed by the brim of his wide hat. His eyes, sharp and probing, seemed to see straight through John. "I've been expecting you," the elder said, his voice gravelly. "Come in inside." The cabin was dimly lit, the air thick with the scent of sage and other pungent herbs. Bundles of dried plants hung from the ceiling, and strange symbols were etched into the walls. The elder motioned for John to sit at a small wooden table. "You're here because of the dog," the elder said without preamble. John's breath hitched. "You know about it," the elder nodded slowly. "It's not just any dog. You've brought a sacred creature to harm, and now you face the consequences." John's fist clenched. "I didn't know. I thought it was just an animal. We were desperate." The elder's gaze hardened. "Ignorance does not absolve you. That dog was not of this world. It was a guardian, bound to protect the spirit of a wronged soul. By killing it, you have unleashed its wrath, and the soul it guarded now seeks vengeance." John's heart sank. "What can we do to stop it?" The elder leaned forward, his voice low and deliberate. "This curse is tied to more than just the dog. It is tied to your family's sins. The spirits will not rest until they have been appeased. To break the curse, you must confront the truth and atone for your wrongs." "What truth?" John demanded, his voice rising. "What do they want from us?" The elder sighed, his expression grim. "Only you know that. But heed this: the spirits will test you. They will strip away your lies and force you to face the pain you've caused. If you resist, they will destroy everything you hold dear." John left the cabin with a heavy heart, the elder's words echoing in his mind. As he made his way back home, the forest seemed darker, the air colder. Shadows flickered at the edge of his vision, and the faint growl of the dog seemed to follow him. When he reached the house, Martha was waiting for him on the porch. Her face lit up with hope when she saw him, but it quickly faded when she noticed his grim expression. "What did he say?" she asked. John hesitated, then sighed. "The dog was sacred. Killing it awakened a curse tied to our past sins. He said we have to face the truth and atone." Martha's face paled. "Our past sins? John, what does that mean?" John looked away, his jaw tightening. "I don't know," he lied. "But we'll figure it out." That night, the house seemed more alive than ever. The whispers grew louder, more insistent. The growling sounded closer, and the clawing at the walls became frantic. Michael, clutching his notebook, sat in the corner of the living room, his eyes darting nervously around the room. "They're angry," he whispered. "They know we haven't done anything." John stood in the center of the room, his fists clenched. "What do you want from us?" he shouted into the void. "What truth do you want us to face?" The whisper stopped abruptly, and for a moment the house was eerily silent. Then, a single voice emerged, deep and resonant. "Confess." Martha clung to John's arm, her nails digging into his skin. "Confess to what?" she whispered, her voice trembling. The voice didn't answer. Instead, the white dog appeared in the doorway, its glowing eyes fixed on John. Behind it, the shadowy figure of the man loomed, his face obscured but his presence suffocating. "You know what you've done," the man said, his voice cold and unforgiving. "Confess or lose everything." John's breath caught in his throat. Memories he had long buried began to surface, each one sharper and more painful than the last. He fell to his knees, his head in his hands, as the weight of his guilt threatened to crush him. Martha knelt beside him, her tears flowing freely. "John, please," she begged. "Whatever it is, just say it. We have to end this." John looked up, his face pale and haunted. "It's my fault," he whispered. "All of it. I killed a man. Years ago. It was an accident. But I ran. I never told anyone. The dog, it must be his. This is my punishment." The room fell silent, the air heavy with the weight of John's confession. The dog's growl deepened, and the shadowy figure stepped closer. "This is only the beginning," the man said. "You must atone for all your sins. Only then will we rest." To be continued. Part 6. Ritual of Redemption. The night air hung heavy as John sat alone in the dimly lit living room. The whispers had quieted, but the oppressive presence of the curse still weighed on him. His confession had torn open old wounds, but the shadows and growling persisted, unyielding. The elder's words echoed in his mind to break the curse. "You must confront the truth and atone." Martha emerged from the kitchen, carrying a steaming cup of tea. She placed it on the table beside John and sat down, her eyes searching his weary face. "What did he mean, John?" "Atone for all your sins," she asked softly. John ran his hands through his hair, his voice hoarse. "There's more, Martha. Things I've kept buried. Things I thought would never resurface." He paused, his gaze distant. "Years ago, before I met you, I killed a woman." Martha's gasp filled the room, but she said nothing, waiting for him to continue. "It wasn't intentional. She was a drifter, a stranger in the village. We argued over something trivial. I don't even remember what. My anger got the best of me. I pushed her, and she hit her head. She died instantly." Martha's hands trembled as she clutched her knees. "And the dog? Is it hers?" John nodded. "She had a white dog. It was loyal to her, always by her side. After she died, it disappeared. I thought it had run off, but now—" He couldn't finish. The weight of his guilt choked the words from his throat. The next morning, the elder arrived at their doorstep, summoned by John's desperate plea for guidance. He carried a small satchel filled with dried herbs, candles, and other strange items. His face was grave as he entered the house, his presence bringing an unnatural stillness. "Have you confessed?" the elder asked, his sharp eyes narrowing as he looked at John. John nodded. "I told him everything." The elder glanced at Martha and Michael, both pale and trembling. "Good. But confession is only the first step. The spirits demand more. Tonight we will perform the ritual of atonement. It will not be easy, and it will not be safe." Martha clutched Michael's hand. "What will happen?" The elder set his satchel on the table and began unpacking its contents. "The spirits will test you. They will force you to confront your sins, to endure the pain you've caused. Only by facing the truth and asking for forgiveness can you hope to break the curse." As the moon rose high, casting an eerie glow over the forest, the family gathered in the backyard. The elder had drawn a circle of salt around them, placing candles at each cardinal point. A small fire burned in the center, its smoke carrying the sharp scent of herbs. The elder began chanting in a low, guttural voice, his words foreign and ancient. The air grew colder with each syllable, and the shadows around them seemed to thicken. Michael clung to Martha, his eyes wide with fear, while John stood rigid, his fists clenched. "Spirits of the wrong," the elder intoned, his voice rising above the crackling fire. "We call upon you to witness this act of contrition. Hear our plea and grant us your mercy." The ground beneath them trembled, and the fire flared, casting long, flickering shadows. The growling returned, deep and guttural, echoing from the darkness beyond the circle. The white dog emerged first, its glowing eyes fixed on John. Behind it, the shadowy figure of the woman took shape, her face obscured but her presence unmistakable. John stepped forward, his knees shaking. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice breaking. "I was angry and careless. I didn't mean to hurt you. Please, forgive me." The figure said nothing, but the air around them grew heavier, pressing down on their chests. The elder continued his chant, his voice commanding, "Spirits, reveal the truth. Show this man the weight of his actions." The shadows twisted and writhed, forming scenes from John's past. The woman's lifeless body appeared on the ground, blood pooling beneath her head. Her dog sat beside her, its mournful howls piercing the silence. John watched in horror as his younger self fled the scene, leaving the woman and her loyal companion behind. "You abandoned her," the shadowy figure hissed, her voice sharp and accusing. "You left her to rot, forgotten and unloved. And now you dare to ask for mercy." John fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "I was a coward. I was wrong. Please, tell me what I can do to make this right." The dog stepped forward, its growl low and menacing. The woman's figure loomed over John, her shadowy form flickering like a dying flame. You cannot undo the past, but you can honor it. Take responsibility for your actions. Seek justice for those you've wronged. The ritual continued into the early hours of the morning. John was forced to relive his darkest moments, each one more harrowing than the last. He confessed his sins, his voice raw and broken, while the spirits listened in silence. Martha and Michael watched helplessly, their hearts aching for him. As the first light of dawn broke through the trees, the woman's figure began to fade. The dog remained, its glowing eyes softening as it looked at John. The elder's chant slowed, his voice dropping to a whisper. "It is done," the elder said, his voice weary. "The spirits have heard your plea. Whether they grant mercy is up to them." The dog turned and disappeared into the forest, leaving the family alone in the circle of salt. The air felt lighter, the oppressive presence lifted, but the scars of the night remained. For the first time in weeks, the house was silent. The whispers were gone, and the growling no longer echoed through the halls. But John knew their journey was far from over. The curse had been lifted, but the weight of his sins would stay with him forever. "We'll start again," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tears in her eyes. "We'll make things right," John nodded, his resolve firm. "We have to. For her. For us." As the family embraced, the faintest howl echoed in the distance, a reminder of the price they had paid and the lessons they had learned. To be continued. Part 7. The Confrontation. The midnight ritual had summoned more than shadows. It had drawn the full force of the spirits into the circle. The air was thick with tension as the spectral dog stepped forward, its glowing eyes fixated on John. Behind it, the figure of the murdered woman solidified, her translucent form illuminated by the flickering flames of the ritual fire. John's knees buckled, and he felt an unnatural cold seep into his bones. I'm sorry," he stammered, his voice cracking. "Please, I never meant for this to happen." The woman's face, though blurred and ethereal, twisted in anger. Her voice rang out, a chilling blend of sorrow and rage. "Your words mean nothing. You let me die. You abandoned me. And now you seek forgiveness? Justice must be served." The elder raised his hands, his chant reaching a crescendo. "Spirits of the wronged, we acknowledge your pain. Grant us the chance to make amends." But the woman's spectral form stepped closer to John, her shadow stretching across the ground like a living thing. "There is no atonement without suffering," she said, her voice echoing unnaturally. "You will feel the weight of every moment I was lost and forgotten." The fire roared, its flames licking higher into the night sky. As the scene around them transformed, shadows from John's past unfolded in vivid detail. The family stood frozen as they watched the young woman's final moments replayed before their eyes. John's younger self, his face contorted in anger, shoved the woman. Her head struck a jagged rock, and she crumpled to the ground. Her white dog barked frantically, nuzzling her still form. The younger John hesitated, his hands trembling before turning and fleeing the scene. Martha sobbed as she witnessed the act. "John, how could you?" John clutched his chest, the guilt crushing him. "I was scared, Martha. I didn't know what to do." The spectral woman raised her hand and the image dissolved, replaced by the desolation of the forest. Her dog, now emaciated and alone, wandered aimlessly, howling into the void. Each mournful cry pierced the circle like a blade. "You left me to rot," the woman said, stepping closer. "You left him to grieve. And now you expect mercy." The elder's voice cut through the tension, steady and commanding. "Spirits, vengeance cannot bring peace. If justice is your goal, allow this man to atone. Grant him the chance to make amends." The woman hesitated, her form flickering like a dying flame. "Atonement," she repeated, her tone dripping with disdain. "And what of my suffering? What of the years stolen from me?" The dog growled low, stepping protectively beside her. Its eyes burned brighter, and the growl deepened into a sound that resonated in the very earth beneath them. The candles around the circle snuffed out one by one, plunging them into near darkness. Only the fire remained, casting long, eerie shadows. John fell to his knees, his voice raw. "Please, I'll do anything. I'll dedicate my life to making this right. Just tell me what you want." The woman loomed over him, her gaze unrelenting. "You must feel what I felt. You must live with the fear, the pain, and the loneliness. The fire surged once more, and John let out a cry as a spectral force enveloped him. Scenes of the woman's suffering played out in his mind, her despair as she lay dying, her dog's heartbreak, her spirit's torment as it wandered the forest, bound to the animal she loved. Each memory tore through him like shards of glass. He felt her anguish, her longing for justice, and her fury at being forgotten. The pain was overwhelming, and John collapsed, clutching his head. Martha and Michael tried to rush to his side, but the elder held them back. "This is his trial," he said grimly. "If he cannot endure it, the curse will claim us all." John gasped for air, his tears mixing with the dirt beneath him. "I'm sorry," he whispered over and over. "I'm so sorry." The spectral woman knelt before him, her face softening ever so slightly. "Words cannot undo the past," she said, "but perhaps actions can mend the future. You must protect those who cannot protect themselves. You must ensure no one suffers as I did." John nodded, his voice barely audible. "I will. I swear it." The woman stood, her form beginning to fade. "This is your last chance. Do not waste it." The dog let out one final, echoing howl before it too began to dissolve. The fire died down, and the oppressive weight that had hung over the circle lifted. The air was still, the night eerily quiet. The elder stepped forward, placing a hand on John's shoulder. "It is done. The spirits have found their justice." John looked up at him, his face streaked with tears. "Am I free?" The elder's expression was unreadable. "Freedom is earned, not given. You have been granted the chance to redeem yourself. What you do with it will determine your fate." Martha and Michael rushed to John, helping him to his feet. The family embraced, their relief mingled with exhaustion. For the first time in weeks, the whispers and growls were gone. The house, though still shadowed by the events of the night, felt lighter. As dawn broke over the forest, the family stood together, their faces turned toward the rising sun. The journey ahead would be difficult, but they had been given the chance to start anew. In the distance, the faintest echo of a howl lingered, a reminder of the price they had paid and the promise they had made. To be continued. Part 8. The Ultimate Sacrifice. The circle of ash and salt sat eerily still under the pale light of the moon. The fire in the center crackled unnaturally, the flames licking higher and brighter than any ordinary blaze. John knelt at its heart, the weight of his decision pressing down on him like a leaden shroud. The spectral dog paced around the edge of the circle, its glowing eyes locked onto him, while the translucent form of the murdered woman loomed just beyond, her sorrowful rage palpable. "Spirits," the elder intoned, his voice cutting through the oppressive silence, "we have heard your demands. This man has confessed his sins. What will you require to end this torment?" The woman's ghost stepped forward, her form wavering like mist caught in a breeze. Her voice, layered with anguish and fury, seemed to echo from all directions. "Words cannot undo what was done," she said, "but balance must be restored." His life for the justice he stole. John's breath hitched, but his resolve held firm. He had expected this. The weight of his guilt of years spent hiding from his past bore down on him. But now, looking at Martha and Michael, pale, trembling but alive, he found strength. "I accept," he said, his voice steady. "If my life will bring you peace, then take it," Martha screamed, rushing forward, her tears catching the moonlight. "No, John. There has to be another way." The elder caught her by the arms, his voice calm but unyielding. "The spirits have spoken. To interfere would invite their wrath." Michael clutched at his mother, his voice breaking. "Dad, please. Don't do this." John turned to them, his eyes soft and filled with sorrow. "This is my burden, my sin. If this will save you both, it's worth it." The flames surged higher as the spectral woman raised her hand, and the dog stepped closer, its growl vibrating through the air like a drumbeat. Shadows flickered wildly, and the oppressive weight of the curse seemed to press harder on the family. The elder began chanting, his voice rising in cadence, each word carrying a weight of ancient power. "Your acceptance is noted," the woman said, her tone almost gentle. "But the pain must match the crime." The fire roared, its tendrils of flame leaping toward John, He gasped as the heat enveloped him, searing his flesh. Yet he did not cry out. He remained upright, his eyes closed, his lips moving in silent prayer. "Stop this," Martha shrieked, struggling against the elder's grip. "Please, stop." Michael fell to his knees, tears streaming down his face. "It's not fair. He's trying to make it right." The woman's gaze turned to them, cold and unwavering. "Justice is never fair." It is balanced. John's body trembled as the fire consumed him, the flames dancing around his figure with unnatural life. Memories surged through his mind, vivid and relentless. Every mistake, every selfish act, every moment he failed those who depended on him. He saw the woman's face as she fell, her head striking the jagged rock, and the blood pooling beneath her. He saw the dog, steadfast at her side, its mournful howl splitting the silence of the forest. The fire burned brighter, its heat intensifying, but John held firm. Through the pain, he whispered, "I'm sorry. I'll carry this forever if it means you can rest." The spectral woman's form flickered, her expression softening. Her voice, once harsh and filled with anger, now carried a note of sadness. "Your pain is great. Perhaps it is enough." The dog stepped back, its growl fading into a low whine. The flames around John dimmed, and for a moment, silence enveloped the circle. Then, with a final, brilliant surge, the fire consumed him entirely. John let out a breathless cry, his body crumpling as the flames extinguished themselves, leaving only ash and the faint scent of smoke. The spectral woman knelt beside the ashes, her hand hovering just above them. "Your sacrifice is accepted," she said quietly. "May your soul find peace." She turned to Martha and Michael, her gaze steady but tinged with sorrow. "Live well, for his sake. Remember what was lost, and do not let his sacrifice be in vain." The woman and the dog began to dissolve into the night, their forms fading like morning mist. The oppressive weight that had lingered for weeks lifted, and the air grew still. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, the house was quiet. Martha and Michael knelt beside the circle, their grief raw and overwhelming. The elder placed a hand on Martha's shoulder, his voice gentle. "His sacrifice has broken the curse. The spirits are at peace." Martha looked up at him, her tears glistening. "But what about us? How do we go on without him?" The elder's gaze was somber. "You honor him by living, by ensuring the pain he bore was not in vain." The days that followed were somber but filled with purpose. Martha and Michael worked together to rebuild their lives, their hearts heavy with loss but buoyed by gratitude. The whispers and growls were gone, replaced by the gentle sounds of the forest returning to life. The house, once a prison of terror, began to feel like a home again. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Michael stood at the edge of the woods. A faint breeze stirred the leaves, and for a moment he thought he heard a soft bark. He smiled, his tears falling freely. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. "I'll make you proud." To be continued. Part 9. Aftermath. The morning after John's sacrifice, the house was silent for the first time in weeks. The oppressive weight that had lingered in every corner was gone, leaving behind a hollow stillness. The air, once thick with whispers and growls, now carried the gentle sounds of the forest waking to a new day. Yet within the silence lay the echoes of loss that would haunt Martha and Michael forever. Martha sat on the front porch, staring out at the woods. Her hands trembled as she clutched the steaming cup of tea she had barely touched. The elder's words from the previous night replayed in her mind, "You honor him by living," but the enormity of the task felt insurmountable. Michael emerged from the house, his face pale and drawn. He had aged overnight, his boyish demeanor replaced by a quiet solemnity. He sat beside his mother, silent for a long moment before speaking. "Do you think he's at peace now?" Martha swallowed hard, blinking back tears. "I have to believe he is. He gave everything to make sure we could go on." Michael nodded, his gaze fixed on the woods. "It's up to us now, isn't it?" Martha reached out, squeezing his hand. "Yes, we'll make him proud." In the days that followed, Martha and Michael began the painstaking process of rebuilding their lives. The house, though still filled with memories of John, felt different, lighter, as if it had shed the dark weight of the curse. They cleaned the salt and ash from the yard, burying what little remained of the ritual in the woods, marking the spot with a simple wooden cross. The nights, once filled with dread, became calm. Michael no longer woke up screaming, and the sound of claws scratching at the walls was gone. Yet neither Martha nor Michael could sleep soundly. Their dreams were often haunted by the vision of John surrounded by flames, his anguished but determined face etched into their memories. One evening, as they sat by the fireplace, Martha brought out a small box of photographs. She thumbed through them, stopping at an old picture of John holding a baby Michael. His face, full of joy and hope, seemed almost unrecognizable compared to the man consumed by guilt and regret in his final days. "He was so happy then," she said softly, showing Michael the photo. Michael studied it, his lips pressing into a thin line. "I didn't understand how much he carried. He never told us." Martha nodded, tears slipping down her cheeks. "He thought he was protecting us. But in the end, he showed us what it means to face your mistakes." They sat in silence for a while, the crackling fire filling the space between them. Eventually, Michael spoke again. "I want to do something for him." To honor him, Martha looked at him, her brow furrowed. "What do you mean?" "I don't know yet," Michael admitted. "But something that shows we haven't forgotten, that we've learned from what happened." As the weeks turned into months, Michael found his purpose. He began volunteering at a local animal shelter, drawn by a sense of responsibility he couldn't quite explain. Caring for the animals, many of whom had been abandoned or mistreated, gave him a sense of connection to his father's sacrifice and the white dog whose spirit had lingered so long. Martha, too, found solace in small acts of kindness. She started helping her neighbors, sharing the story of her family's ordeal as a cautionary tale about guilt, redemption, and the power of love. Though she didn't speak of the curse or the spirits directly, her words carried the weight of her experience, touching those who heard them. The wooden cross in the woods became a place of quiet reflection. Every week, Martha and Michael would visit, bringing fresh flowers and sitting in silence. They didn't speak of what had happened, but the act of tending the site became a ritual of its own, a way to honor John and the lessons he had left behind. One day, as Michael knelt to place a bouquet of daisies at the base of the cross, he felt a soft breeze brush past him. It carried a faint, familiar scent, the earthy warmth of the forest mingled with a hint of smoke. He froze, his heart racing, and for a moment, he thought he heard the faint echo of a bark. "Did you hear that?" he asked, turning to Martha. She smiled faintly, her eyes glistening. "Maybe it's his way of telling us he's still watching over us." Michael nodded, his chest tightening. "Thank you, Dad," he whispered. "I'll make you proud." The seasons changed, and life continued. The scars of the past never fully healed, but they became part of the family's story, a reminder of the strength they had found in each other. The curse had ended, but its lessons remained etched into their hearts like the shadows that had once haunted their home. In the end, the white dog's legacy was not one of vengeance, but of redemption. And as the forest grew lush and vibrant around the house, it seemed to whisper a single, resounding truth, even in the face of darkness. Love and forgiveness could light the way. The end.